Judge insults Kamala Harris in court. Minutes later, he's dragged out in handcuffs before everyone. Kamala Harris pushed open the heavy courtroom door, heels echoing sharply against the marble floor as she stepped into a space charged with tension. Her tailored navy blue suit contrasted starkly with the dark mahogany of the benches and walls, but it was the fire in her eyes that truly stood out. Reporters lined the gallery, scribbling notes and angling cameras, eager for drama. This was no ordinary hearing. It was a high-stakes corruption case against Gregory Moore, a wealthy real estate tycoon accused of embezzling millions in state funds. Kamala had spent weeks poring over financial records, mapping every hidden transaction, memorizing every inconsistency. She came armed with truth, data, and a moral compass honed through decades of witnessing injustice. But before she could even reach the prosecution table, a voice thundered through the courtroom, cutting, cruel, and designed to humiliate. "Miss Harris," Judge Howard Gates sneered from the bench, his tone dripping disdain, "did you walk into the right room? This is a court of law, not a diversity luncheon or some rally for angry women." The air went still, not a sound. Then quiet snickers rolled from the defense table. Cameras clicked. No one intervened. Kamala froze for only half a breath, her fingers tightening around her briefcase. But she didn't flinch. She took another step forward, chin high, spine straight, refusing to let her presence be diminished by a man who had turned the gavel into a weapon. Her heart pounded, but her voice when it came was steady. "Your Honor, I'm here on behalf of the people to present evidence in a criminal case involving the misappropriation of taxpayer funds." Gates leaned back in his chair with theatrical exhaustion, eyes rolling upward as if bored already. "Oh, spare me the sanctimony," he said, waving a hand. "You're here for the spotlight. Don't pretend otherwise." The audacity of it all hung in the room like a foul odor. Kamala looked to the jury box, then the crowd. Not one official, not one attorney, not one reporter spoke up. She was alone. A black woman standing in a courtroom designed to silence her before she spoke. Gregory Moore, seated comfortably beside his legal team, smirked with his arms crossed, oozing arrogance. He had friends in high places. This trial to him was nothing more than an inconvenience. The judge was clearly on his side. The message couldn't have been clearer. Kamala wasn't supposed to win this. She wasn't supposed to challenge a man with billions and a friend wearing the robe. Gates adjusted his glasses and peered down at her. "Let's just get this over with, Miss Harris. I hope you brought more than emotional outbursts and race-based grandstanding." Every word hit like a slap, calculated to provoke, to dismantle her composure in front of a sea of eyes and judgment. Kamala's jaw clenched. The weight of history pressed against her shoulders. The echoes of every courtroom that had ever told a woman like her she didn't belong. But she didn't scream. She didn't fold. She placed her briefcase on the table, opened it with calm precision, and removed the first folder. Her movements were controlled, almost ritualistic, as if every motion was an act of resistance. "With all due respect," she said, eyes locked on Gates, "I'll let the evidence speak louder than your contempt." The courtroom tensed. She had drawn a line, not with shouting, but with unwavering dignity. Her voice didn't rise, but the silence that followed roared louder than anything she could have shouted. Gates scoffed again, clearly irritated she hadn't broken. "We'll see," he muttered, tapping his gavel lazily. "Proceed, if you must." Kamala Harris stood tall at the prosecution table, her hands steady but her breath caught in her throat as she prepared to speak. She flipped open the folder containing damning evidence. Financial discrepancies, falsified invoices, internal emails that could sink Gregory Moore's empire in seconds. But the moment her lips parted, Judge Howard Gates slammed his gavel with a sharp crack. "Miss Harris, if you're going to drown us in paperwork, at least make it worthwhile," he barked, tone mocking, his voice slicing through the air like a whip. She paused, adjusted her posture, and tried again. "Your Honor, if I may direct the court to Exhibit A—" "Denied," he interrupted coldly. "We've all seen enough charts for one day." The defense table erupted in quiet chuckles. The courtroom wasn't just against her, it was laughing at her. And no one, not a single soul, moved to stop it. She swallowed the knot in her throat, flipped to the next page, and continued, refusing to let the heat rising in her chest derail her. This document shows the diversion of funds from the Public Housing Initiative directly into Moore's private firm, she said, her voice gaining strength. But Gates leaned forward, feigning confusion. So, we're accusing wealthy people of being successful now? He smirked, laughter again. Her words twisted into mockery, her evidence reduced to a punchline. No, Your Honor, she said, jaw tight. We're accusing a man of stealing from the very people the government is meant to protect. Ah, Gates drawled, raising a brow. So it's that kind of prosecution. The phrase hung in the air like poison. She knew what he meant. A political case. A woman of color on a crusade. The stereotypes swirled like vultures above her head. Kamala's pulse quickened. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears. Still, she stayed composed, anchoring herself to the table as she lifted another document, an internal memo time-stamped and signed by Moore's CFO. But the moment she lifted it, Gates scoffed. Miss Harris, do you plan on reading every office memo in Moore's company? Because at this rate, we'll be here until Christmas. Her teeth clenched behind a tight-lipped smile. She couldn't afford to lose control. She was being baited, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The defense team exchanged smug glances, and the spectators, sensing a power imbalance, leaned into the show. This wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a stage, and she was being set up to fail in front of a national audience. Her voice, when she spoke again, was quieter, but sharper. This memo contains direct instructions to conceal the source of funding, she said. It corroborates 3 separate testimonies. Miss Harris, Gates snapped, his gavel striking again. I'm going to stop you right there. If you continue with this kind of dramatization, I will hold you in contempt. Gasps fluttered through the gallery. Kamala blinked. Contempt? For reading evidence? Her spine went rigid. She'd faced intimidation before, but never so blatant, so deliberate. It wasn't just disrespect, it was sabotage. She wasn't being given a chance to present a case. She was being cornered, choked, and stripped of her voice. Still, she tried again. She couldn't let him win. She gestured to the screen beside her and called up a set of financial ledgers, color-coded, cross-referenced, bulletproof. These records, she began, but Gates waved a hand. Irrelevant. They show the exact pipeline. Speculative. With due respect, Your Honor. Miss Harris, enough. His voice rose. You've wasted this court's time with your little theater long enough. Something in her snapped, but she held it in, pressing her palm flat against the folder to steady herself. She looked at the jury. Some looked away. Others stared blankly. No one was fighting for her, not even the law. Her heart ached, but her mind stayed razor-focused. Every time she tried to lift her voice, it was trampled by authority disguised as law. Every piece of truth was dismissed as bias. Every fact framed as fiction. And yet, she knew if she stepped back now, she'd be giving them what they wanted: submission, obedience, silence. She was tired of being silenced, tired of shrinking into the shadows of courtrooms built by men who had never been told no. But rage was not her weapon. Proof was, and she still had more. Kamala stood motionless, her fingers wrapped tightly around the edge of the prosecution table, as the words from Judge Gates echoed like gunshots in her ears. You don't belong at the prosecution table, he said with an icy smirk, his voice deliberately loud enough to reach every corner of the courtroom. The more suitable place for someone like you is behind the coffee cart. The silence that followed only lasted a second before it shattered into low, smug laughter. Chuckles rippled from the defense table, then spread like a virus to the courtroom gallery. Even a few jurors failed to hide their grins. Kamala's chest tightened, not from embarrassment, but from the sting of recognition. She had spent years fighting for her right to stand in that exact spot, poring over documents, burning through sleepless nights, trying to be twice as prepared, twice as correct, and yet, here she was, reduced to a racist punchline, a joke in the room she had worked so hard to earn her place in. She blinked slowly, fighting the urge to react, to scream, to slam her fist on the table and demand the respect she deserved. But she knew better. They wanted her to break. They wanted the angry black woman. They wanted her passion to be misinterpreted as hysteria. So instead, she stood straighter. She reached into her case and pulled out a file, Exhibit D, containing irrefutable contract violations with timestamped approvals. She held it up slowly, as if daring anyone to call it emotional. "Your Honor," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this document outlines misallocated state funds signed under false pretenses." Gates didn't even glance at it. He waved his hand dismissively, like he was swatting at a fly. "Denied," he said flatly. "No need to waste this court's time with more of your redundant paperwork." Kamala didn't lower the file. She held it there, in full view of the press, the jury, and the public, who had come to witness justice but were watching a mockery instead. "This is a signed contract, Your Honor, showing that—" "I said denied," he barked louder. "This is not your classroom, Miss Harris. You don't get to lecture us." This time there was no laughter, just silence. The laughter had turned into something colder, a collective discomfort. She tried again. "Your Honor, this ledger proves that Gregory Moore received twice the budget approved by the city, funneled into dummy corporations under his control." She placed the binder on the evidence screen. Pages of spreadsheets and payment orders illuminated the monitors in front of the jury. Gates slammed his gavel once. "That's enough. Strike it from the record. That ledger is inadmissible." "Inadmissible?" she asked, unable to hide the incredulity in her voice. "It was subpoenaed by my office, with full authorization." Gates leaned forward slowly, his eyes narrow slits of condescension. "Then perhaps you need a lesson in the proper interpretation of admissibility." The gallery stirred again, whispers snaking through the rows. Kamala could feel it, the psychological warfare closing in. Every avenue of logic was being blocked. Every door she opened was slammed before she could step through. Not because her evidence was flawed, not because her case was weak, but because she was the one presenting it. Her skin, her voice, her very presence was the crime. She looked to the jury. Some avoided her eyes. Others looked confused, conflicted, uncertain whether they were watching a courtroom or a performance. And in a way they were, because Judge Gates was performing dominance, and Kamala was the intended humiliation. She moved to the next document, a city expenditure report signed by Moore's firm showing direct transactions with public funds diverted within 48 hours. "I request permission to submit Exhibit E, city financial logs, reviewed and verified by 2 independent forensic analysts," she stated clearly. "Denied," Gates snapped before she even finished the sentence. "Miss Harris, how many times must I say this? This courtroom is not your personal bulletin board." A flicker of anger pierced her composure. Not rage, but a raw, cutting clarity. He wasn't even pretending anymore. The bias was no longer hidden, it was institutionalized, and everyone in that courtroom was complicit by their silence. Kamala's hands trembled slightly as she opened the final folder, the one she had saved for last, the one with Moore's personal email exchanges, acknowledging the fraud. It was the smoking gun. She had triple-checked its authenticity, verified server timestamps, and obtained a digital forensic affidavit. It was airtight. It should have ended the trial right there. But she knew before she even spoke what was coming. She stood tall anyway. "Your Honor, I request to submit Exhibit F, which contains direct written admissions from—" "Strike it." Gates's voice cut through her like a blade. "I don't need to hear the rest. This is not how we conduct justice in my courtroom." Kamala stared at him. For a moment, time stopped. Her years in law school, her internships, her clerkships, her victories, her failures, the faces of clients she had defended, the weight of every woman, every person of color who had ever stood before a man like this and been told, "You don't belong here." It all came crashing into that moment, and yet she didn't crumble. Without a word, Kamala Harris reached in her folder and pulled out a single document, one she hadn't intended to show this early, but the moment demanded escalation. She moved with quiet precision, her movements deliberate, as though each second that passed was sharpening the blade of her intent. She slid the sheet beneath the projector's glass surface and flipped the switch. The screen at the front of the courtroom blinked, then filled with an image, a scanned city contract, dense with legal language, rows of budget allocations, And at the very bottom, one signature. It was bold, clear, unmistakable. Kamala didn't speak. She didn't need to. A wave of murmurs rippled across the courtroom as every eye locked onto the name in cursive ink. Howard Gates, the judge's name, at the bottom of a document approving illegal fund transfers to Gregory Moore's company. The room seemed to inhale collectively. Judge Gates didn't move at first. His mouth tightened, but his voice, when it came, was cold and steady. Too steady. "This document," he said, clearing his throat as his eyes darted to the screen, "is not legally admissible. It was improperly obtained. I'm striking it from the record." But the words rang hollow. The damage was done. The jury had seen it. The press had seen it. Everyone had seen it. The press had seen it. Everyone had seen it. And more importantly, they knew he had seen it too. A ripple of energy passed through the gallery like the tremor before an earthquake. For a moment, no one breathed. Then whispers began to spread like wildfire. Cautious at first, then louder, full of shock, disbelief, and growing realization. The courtroom was no longer a performance space. It was a battleground, and Kamala had just fired the first shot. She stood perfectly still, her arms crossed in front of her, watching Gates with unblinking calm. Her silence screamed louder than any accusation. Across the room, the defense team scrambled. Papers rustled. Moore leaned toward his lawyer, whispering furiously. The judge shifted in his chair, suddenly looking smaller beneath his robe. The authority he once wielded like a sword now trembling in his grasp. "Miss Harris," he said finally, his tone clipped, "you will cease this line of presentation immediately. This is bordering on contempt." Kamala raised an eyebrow, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "With respect, Your Honor, the people of this courtroom have a right to understand the full extent of this corruption, especially when the presiding authority appears to be personally involved." Gasps erupted. Even the bailiff's eyes widened. Gates slammed the gavel once, twice. The sound echoed like gunfire. "I will not tolerate this behavior," he barked. But the cracks had already formed. The gavel no longer silenced the room. It amplified it. Kamala stepped forward, her tone unwavering. "This document was subpoenaed through proper federal channels. Verified, time-stamped, authenticated." She gestured to the screen, letting the image linger. "If there's any objection to its legitimacy, I invite a full forensic audit." Her challenge hung in the air, undeniable and unflinching. Gates opened his mouth, but no words came out. His jaw clenched. His knuckles whitened around the gavel. He was cornered, not by force, but by facts. Cold, inescapable, documented truth. From the gallery, reporters began scribbling frantically. Phones lifted, not to scroll, but to capture. Somewhere in the back, a camera clicked. This wasn't just a court proceeding anymore. It was a public reckoning. Moore's lawyer stood up, attempting to protest, but his voice was drowned out by the mounting chatter in the room. The tide had shifted. Kamala could feel it. For the first time all morning, she wasn't speaking into silence. She wasn't battling alone. Truth had pierced the veil of intimidation, and Howard Gates knew it. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. But her next step was like thunder. Calm, heavy, irrevocable. "I'm not here to attack this court," she said slowly, making eye contact with each juror. "But if the court is compromised, then the people deserve to know. They deserve better." Her voice echoed with clarity and conviction. No theatrics, no performance, just the raw force of integrity standing in the face of corruption. It wasn't just about Moore anymore. It was about who had enabled him, who had protected him, who had signed his deals in the shadows, and now sat, cloaked in robes, pretending to arbitrate justice. Judge Gates's mask cracked. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. His fingers trembled as he reached for his glass of water. But the silence that followed Kamala's words was louder than any protest he could summon. The courtroom had changed. The rules had shifted. And Kamala Harris, calm, relentless, unbreakable, had just taken control. Not through fury, not through manipulation, but through truth. Displayed on a screen, signed in ink, bearing the name of a man who thought he was untouchable. And now everyone knew he wasn't. Kamala Harris reached calmly into her briefcase, her fingers brushing past thick folders and legal pads until they closed around a small, unmarked black recorder. She didn't say a word. Not yet. Her silence, deliberate and controlled, carried more tension than any outburst ever could. The courtroom, still buzzing from the revelation of Judge Gates's signature on the illegal contract, had started to simmer down. But Kamala wasn't done. Not even close. She placed the device on the prosecution table, pressed play, and took a step back. A sharp click echoed through the speakers, followed by a low, grainy voice, shaky at first but unmistakable. "Destroy those files," the voice snarled. "Don't let Kamala get her hands on them. If she sees what's in there, we're finished." The words sliced through the courtroom like glass. The room froze. Mouths hung open. Pens stopped mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes turned toward the bench. Judge Howard Gates didn't move. For the first time that morning, the smug smirk had vanished from his face. His posture stiffened, his hand gripped the edge of his desk, and his lips parted, just slightly, as the reality set in. The voice on the tape was his. There was no mistaking it. No one spoke. No one dared. The gallery was silent, save for the low hum of the recording as it played a second time, just loud enough to hammer the point home. Kamala stood still, her arms crossed, eyes locked on Gates. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She let the weight of the evidence do the work. The jury looked stunned. One juror turned pale. Another leaned forward, whispering something inaudible to the person beside him. The defense team had stopped moving entirely. Moore's lead attorney was white-knuckling his notes, his knuckles bone-white. Kamala reached again into her case and pulled out a folder, thick with official stamps and labels. She opened it with quiet precision, revealing a digital transcript, line for line, matching the recording to the word. "This transcript," she said, her voice cool and measured, "is from a federally authorized wiretap placed on a phone registered to one of Gregory Moore's financial consultants." She held the document up for the bailiff to collect. "The voice, as we just heard, belongs to Judge Howard Gates, and the message was intended to obstruct justice." A gasp surged through the gallery, and this time it didn't die down. Reporters began writing furiously. Someone in the back whispered, "Oh my God!" The air in the courtroom had shifted. It wasn't just a legal proceeding anymore. It was a collapse. The courtroom had devolved into chaos. Judge Howard Gates was shouting over the rising murmurs, his gavel hammering against the bench in rapid, frantic bursts that no longer commanded order, but betrayed panic. "This court is adjourned. Remove the audio. Remove the transcript. Bailiff, clear the room." His voice cracked with desperation, no longer the booming authority it had been just minutes ago. But no one was listening. Reporters stood, cameras flashing, pens flying. Jurors whispered furiously among themselves, eyes darting between Kamala and the bench. The defense team looked like a house of cards mid-collapse, with Gregory Moore visibly sweating through his expensive tailored suit. Kamala remained still, calm, grounded, eyes fixed on the man who had mocked her, silenced her, dismissed her. The air was electric. And then, the rear doors of the courtroom burst open. All heads turned in unison. 3 figures stepped through in crisp, dark suits. Their movements were controlled, efficient. No hesitation, no questions. The one in the center held a badge, glinting in the harsh overhead light. "Federal agents," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We're executing a federal arrest warrant." The room froze. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a beat. Judge Gates blinked, stunned, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Kamala didn't flinch. She simply stepped aside, granting them a clear path to the bench. The lead agent continued, voice sharp and unwavering. "Howard Gates, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to suppress federal evidence, and abuse of judicial power." The words struck harder than any gavel. The silence that followed was deafening. Gates rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he grasped the edge of the bench. "You can't be serious," he stammered. "I'm a sitting judge. This is my courtroom." The lead agent didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document, the warrant. "Signed by the Department of Justice, effective immediately," he stated. Gates stumbled back a step, eyes darting wildly across the room as if seeking someone, anyone to save him. But there were no allies left, not Moore, not the court staff, not even the bailiff, who now stood silently to the side, jaw clenched. Kamala watched, her expression unreadable. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. But behind her calm exterior, justice was breathing. The agents moved swiftly, stepping up to the bench with practiced precision. "Place your hands in front of you," one said firmly. Gates hesitated, eyes wide. But when the metal cuffs clicked open, he relented. The sound of steel locking around his wrists echoed through the courtroom like thunder. A gasp rose from the gallery. One juror covered their mouth, a reporter dropped their pen, and in that moment, everything shifted. The robe, the gavel, the elevated bench. None of it could shield him now. He was no longer the all-powerful judge. He was a man in handcuffs, exposed by the very system he once ruled over. As the agents guided him down from the bench, the room erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. Moore shouted something incoherent at his lawyer, who was now sweating bullets. The jury leaned forward in stunned disbelief. But through it all, Kamala stood motionless, eyes never leaving Gates as he was led past her. He couldn't meet her gaze. His eyes dropped to the floor, full of shame, fear, maybe even regret. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage had been done. The truth had been revealed. And the lie that had nearly crushed Kamala had crumbled beneath the weight of undeniable evidence and her unshakable resolve. One of the agents paused beside her on their way out, nodding once in quiet acknowledgement. She returned the gesture, just barely. There were no words needed. This wasn't a victory lap. This was vindication. The kind that comes after being publicly humiliated, ignored, and buried beneath systemic injustice. The kind that doesn't feel triumphant, but necessary. She turned back to the jury, to the gallery, to every spectator who had watched her be ridiculed, dismissed, doubted. Their faces were different now, somber, stunned, some even remorseful. They had seen what power looks like when corrupted, and what courage looks like when it refuses to bow. The agents pushed through the courtroom doors with Gates between them, the cuffs glinting in the light. The gavel lay abandoned on the bench. The chair sat empty, and Kamala Harris, once mocked as a coffee girl, once silenced by prejudice, now stood as the only true authority left in the room. Not because she shouted, not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. With truth, with discipline, with unbreakable integrity. And the system finally was being forced to listen. The handcuffs hadn't even cooled on Judge Howard Gates's wrists when Kamala Harris turned slowly from the bench, her presence like a blade slicing through the stunned silence. She didn't bask in the moment. She didn't let it settle. Because she knew the real architect of the corruption still sat untouched just a few feet away. Gregory Moore, the billionaire real estate mogul whose greed had siphoned millions from public housing, schools, and hospitals. His expensive suit no longer looked pristine. He was sweating through it now, shoulders tight, fingers twitching as he realized the shield he'd always hidden behind. Gates was gone. Kamala's eyes locked on his, unwavering. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her gaze alone told him, "You're next." The courtroom buzz faded into a breathless hush as she stepped closer to Moore's table, documents still clenched in one hand. Moore's lawyer stood abruptly, voice shaky, already trying to interrupt the momentum. "Your Honor, Madam Prosecutor, Mr. Moore would like to enter into negotiations for a plea." The desperation was paper thin. Kamala didn't stop walking. She came to a halt just a step from the defense table, her voice ice cold and sharper than any gavel. "No," she said. One word, absolute. The lawyer flinched. Moore leaned forward, palms up, trembling beneath his forced composure. "Look, I didn't know Gates would go that far," he began. "I didn't order anything illegal. I was misled." Kamala tilted her head slightly, her lips forming the faintest smile, not of amusement, but of disbelief. "You signed every document," she replied. "Your signature approved every wire transfer, every shadow company, every stolen dollar. Don't insult this court with cowardice dressed as confusion." Moore's lips parted, but no words came. Around them, the press was already scribbling, the jury transfixed. Kamala had turned the entire room. The woman they tried to humiliate minutes earlier now stood as the center of power, and she wasn't finished. "Let me be very clear," she said, taking a step closer, her voice like a war drum building in tempo. "There have been too many men like you, wealthy, untouchable, shielded by robes and power, who've walked out of courtrooms without consequences." Her words rang through the courtroom like thunder. "I've watched grandmothers evicted for missing rent while you stole affordable housing funds to build penthouses. I've seen students go hungry while you diverted school budgets into your offshore accounts. And now, when your empire starts to crumble, you want mercy?" Moore's mouth trembled, his polished image unraveling with every second. "We can cooperate. I can give you names," he stammered. "I can expose the whole network. I don't want to go to prison." Kamala's silence was more devastating than a shouted rejection. Her eyes didn't waver. "You should have thought of that before you stole from people who had nothing." She turned to the judge's vacant chair, then to the gallery filled with stunned spectators and reporters. "This case won't end with Gates. It won't end with Moore. We are going to drag this rot into the light, every layer of it." She raised the folder in her hand, a list of secondary companies, false addresses, shell corporations, all tied to Moore's network. "This isn't just fraud, it's institutional theft, and I intend to expose every name behind it." She placed the folder on the evidence table like a final nail in a coffin. Moore slumped in his chair, his face collapsing into his hands. The man who once bought silence with money now had nothing left to spend. Kamala turned away from him, walking back to the center of the courtroom. Her voice lowered, but became even more powerful in its clarity. "The people this man stole from don't get plea deals. They don't get private lawyers or golden parachutes. They get trauma. They get forgotten. They get buried beneath the weight of systems designed to protect men like him." Every sentence hit like a hammer. Reporters couldn't keep up. Jurors nodded unconsciously, drawn into her conviction. Even the bailiff, still frozen near the exit, seemed to breathe easier, like justice was finally doing what it should have years ago. Moore's lawyer stood again, voice breaking. "So what happens now?" Kamala turned her head slightly, her words final. "Now," she said, "you prepare for trial." She walked to her desk, gathered her things with quiet precision, and didn't look back. Her every movement now commanded reverence. The courtroom had once tried to belittle her, bury her, make her small, but now it was clear. She was the storm they should have feared all along. And as the doors closed behind her, even Gregory Moore knew. This time, there would be no escape. Not for him. Not for anyone who thought their wealth could shield them from justice. Not anymore. The victory in the courtroom had barely settled when the shadows began to move. Kamala Harris, once again alone in her office after the arrest of Judge Howard Gates and the public collapse of Gregory Moore's influence, noticed the first signs of something sinister. Her car, a modest hybrid she'd parked behind the district building, had its windshield smashed, the wipers twisted, and a jagged note duct taped to the hood. "Don't dig too deep." It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. That same night, her inbox was flooded with strange activity, password resets, foreign IP logins, and an email from her personal account that she hadn't written, sent to the media with fabricated documents attached. Someone was trying to discredit her. Someone was trying to make her disappear, not with a bullet, but with shadows. It got worse. Her phone buzzed at 2:41 a.m., a block number, no name. She answered without thinking, still foggy from sleep, only to hear breathing. Then a slow, deliberate voice. "You're a black woman in a white man's game. Don't forget that." Then the line went dead. Kamala sat up in the dark, eyes burning. Not from fear, but from fury. This wasn't just about intimidation. It was a message, one designed to push her back into the margins, to remind her of where they thought she belonged. But instead of retreating, she grabbed her laptop, opened her secured drive, and began compiling files. 7 folders, 7 thick, damning cases, each one a vein in the same decaying heart of corruption that had protected Moore and Gates for years. By sunrise, she had printed, sealed, and filed formal requests for federal investigations into 7 separate city officials. Names that appeared too often in Moore's emails. bank transfers that led to campaign funds, land deals that never made the public record. Some of these people were powerful, more powerful than Gates, men with security details, women with national aspirations. Kamala didn't care. She labeled every folder with black ink in capital letters and marched them into the Department of Justice building, one by one, placing them directly into the hands of the Chief Oversight Council. "These are not accusations," she said. "They're facts, and I want them treated as such." Word spread fast. The media tried to spin it as overreach, claiming Kamala was on a warpath, digging too deep, compromising political stability. But she didn't flinch. She didn't respond to pundits or opinion pieces. She just worked. Every morning she woke up knowing her phone could explode with another threat. Every night she left the courthouse under the eye of 2 federal marshals. Her apartment had been broken into. Nothing stolen, just drawers emptied, photos shattered, a single message scrawled on her mirror in red lipstick. "This isn't your story." But she didn't erase the words. She took a picture and attached it to the 8th file she was building. Because the story wasn't hers, it was bigger than her. It was about every voice that had been silenced by the men she was exposing. Her team, small but loyal, rallied around her. Analysts, investigators, even an old colleague from law school who once told her the system would never let someone like her through its gates. They worked late nights under threat of surveillance, using encrypted drives and burner phones, always assuming they were being watched. One day her assistant found a tiny black device lodged beneath Kamala's office chair, an audio bug. The same day, Kamala received a manila envelope with no return address. Inside were photographs of her walking to her car, eating lunch, standing in front of her apartment. The message was clear: "We see you." And yet she didn't blink. She walked straight into a press briefing and looked every camera dead in the lens. "If transparency threatens you," she said, "you are exactly the reason this investigation exists." The room fell silent. The clip went viral. Within 24 hours, 2 more witnesses came forward, both former city contractors, both with information about kickbacks and forged permits tied to the Moore network. The Department of Justice assigned a special task force. Kamala was asked to advise. She didn't hesitate. She brought her files, her timeline, her recordings, her rage. At home, she kept her lights on at night and her blinds closed. Neighbors offered to keep watch. Some were proud, others warned her to be careful. One older woman left a note under her door. "You're doing what we never could. Don't let them break you." Kamala taped that note to her refrigerator. Every morning she read it like scripture. She didn't have the luxury of fear, not anymore. Her name was on the headlines, but the story was written in the blood and silence of those who'd come before her and those who still couldn't speak. Then came the car chase. It happened 3 blocks from the courthouse. A black SUV began tailing her, speeding up every time she turned. At first, she thought it was paranoia. Then it ran a red light to stay on her bumper. She didn't go home. She drove to the federal building, pulled up to the security gate, and let the armed guards take over. The SUV sped off before it could be stopped. The next morning, her tires were slashed in the DOJ parking lot. She filed it all, every photo, every recording, every death threat, into a new folder, not to hide it, to document it, to prove that the truth had enemies, and to show she wasn't backing down. On the 6th week of the investigation, Kamala was called before a closed congressional hearing. They wanted to know if she had enough evidence to pursue charges against 3 city council members and a deputy mayor. She didn't hesitate. She handed them a file that made grown men sit back in their chairs. Wire transfers, witness statements, surveillance photos. A money trail that didn't just lead to Moore, it led beyond him. The rot was deeper than anyone wanted to admit, and Kamala had the map. When she left the hearing, a journalist asked her if she was afraid. She stopped, turned and said, "Of course I'm afraid, but fear is a luxury the people Moore stole from never had. I'm just catching up." That quote was on the front page of 3 national newspapers the next morning, and that night someone set fire to the mailbox outside her building. The flames were small, contained, but the message was loud. Still, she didn't move. She installed more cameras, reinforced the door, and filed the incident under intimidation attempt number 14. Kamala Harris had become more than a prosecutor. She was a mirror held up to a city that had long refused to see its own reflection. And now that the glass had cracked, the people behind the lies were scrambling to patch it. But it was too late. She had seen too much, collected too much, fought too hard. They could slash her tires, hack her email, stalk her apartment, and smear her name. But they couldn't rewrite the evidence. They couldn't undo what had already been brought into the light. Kamala wasn't going anywhere. She was the storm, and she was just getting started. The marble halls of the federal courthouse echoed with tension. This time the courtroom was different, grander, more solemn, the stakes infinitely higher. But it wasn't the polished floors or the U.S. seal above the bench that commanded attention. It was the woman standing at the front of the room, Kamala Harris. No longer the underdog, no longer the target of smirks and whispered dismissal. She stood tall at the federal podium, the very place where truth met power on even ground. Her face was calm, eyes fierce, posture unshakable. She was no longer fighting for a single verdict. She had become the face of a reckoning, and the room knew it. The gallery was packed. Press, federal investigators, victims, former skeptics, even members of Congress seated behind bulletproof glass. The air was thick with anticipation, but Kamala wasn't interested in the spectacle. Her gaze was fixed on one man, Gregory Moore. Once a kingmaker in backrooms and boardrooms, now he sat slumped in the defendant's chair, no designer suit, no army of lawyers, just a wrinkled prison-issued shirt and a pale, trembling face. He didn't look up. He couldn't. His empire had collapsed under the weight of Kamala's unrelenting pursuit. His power had withered beneath evidence, not opinion, and now there was nowhere left to run. The judge called the session to order, voice echoing through the chamber like a bell tolling for a fallen regime. In the case of United States vs. Gregory Moore, how does the defendant plead? The courtroom held its collective breath. Moore's lawyer rose slowly, glancing once at Kamala, as if pleading for mercy. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "Mr. Moore has chosen to enter a plea of guilty to all charges." A gasp rippled across the room. Cameras clicked. Reporters furiously typed. But Kamala didn't react. No smile, no celebration, just stillness, like the eye of a storm. The judge nodded grimly. "Let the record show the defendant has confessed to federal fraud, embezzlement, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy involving public officials." He paused, then continued. "Furthermore, based on the evidence submitted by the prosecution, 5 additional officials named in the investigation have been indicted and taken into federal custody this morning." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. Every head turned back to Kamala, but she didn't bask in it. She didn't meet their stares. Instead, she closed the folder in front of her, gently as if sealing a tomb. The 5 officials were no small names: a deputy mayor, 2 city commissioners, a public housing director, and a former chief of staff for a U.S. senator. Their arrests were coordinated, strategic, built on months of wiretaps, forensic audits, and testimonies Kamala had helped uncover, piece by painful piece. It hadn't been clean. It hadn't been safe. But it had been just. They were the hands behind the curtain, the faces that had stayed hidden while men like Moore played the front. But not anymore. Their names would now be spoken in the same breath as betrayal, their legacy rewritten by truth. When the judge invited Kamala to make a final statement, she stepped forward with steady grace. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of every injustice she had ever faced. "This case was never about one man," she began. "It was about a system that protected corruption, that profited from silence, that counted on fear to keep the truth buried." She looked directly at Moore, then at the judge. Justice doesn't begin with one verdict. It begins when people in power are held accountable to the same laws they write, and today, accountability has spoken. She paused, letting the truth settle. Not for revenge, for restoration. The room was quiet. Even the cameras paused. For once, no one had a follow-up. No one tried to spin it. The story had written itself. And at its center stood Kamala, unmoved, unsilenced. As the judge closed the session and the gavel fell, a wave of emotion swept over the gallery. Victims wept. Reporters stood. Jurors, long dismissed, returned just to watch this final moment. Kamala didn't raise her arms or pump her fists. Instead, she bowed her head, not in submission, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. For justice, for truth, for every voice that had once been drowned in a sea of corruption. The federal agents moved in, escorting Moore from the courtroom in handcuffs. The same agents who once guarded the powerful now held them accountable. Kamala stepped aside to let them pass, her eyes meeting Moore's one last time. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Everything he had built, everything he had corrupted, now lay in ashes behind him. She watched him disappear through the heavy doors, not with hate, but with certainty. He was no longer above the law. He was finally beneath it. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with microphones, flashing bulbs and voices calling her name. But Kamala didn't rush out. She stayed inside for a moment, letting the quiet wash over her. The walls no longer felt hostile. The system that once tried to break her now bore her fingerprints. She walked out slowly, the crowd parting like waves around her. Some cheered, some cried, but most just watched, awed by the woman who had refused to kneel, who had stood taller than the towers of power built to stop her. When she reached the podium outside, she didn't read from notes. She didn't need to. "Today is not the end," she said. "It's the beginning of something we should have had long ago. Equal justice under the law." Her voice carried over the crowd, clear and unwavering. "I was told not to pursue this. I was threatened, followed, undermined. But I am not here today because I was fearless. I'm here because the truth is more powerful than fear." She paused, letting the silence bloom. "We have more work to do, and I will not stop." The applause was thunderous, but still Kamala didn't smile. She stepped back, allowed others to speak, to be seen, to be heard. She had always said this fight wasn't about her, and now as federal prosecutors took the microphone and announced further investigations into related corruption rings, she faded into the background. Not because she was retreating, but because the work had shifted, the system was moving, and she had already done what many thought impossible. She had cracked it open. The courthouse had emptied. The cameras were off, the reporters gone, the crowd dispersed into the cool dusk that settled over the city like a breath held too long. Inside, the courtroom lights dimmed to half-glow, casting long shadows across the wooden benches where hours ago, power had been challenged and truth had prevailed. Kamala Harris stood alone near the bench, her hands resting gently on the prosecution table, staring at the empty seat where justice had finally sat down and stayed. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by exhaustion that pressed into her bones. And yet, she remained standing. Not because she needed to, because she couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. This room had witnessed every blow, every humiliation, every moment when she had to grit her teeth and hold her ground against a world that tried to crush her beneath its rules. Now it was quiet, and in that quiet, she could finally breathe. Her thoughts drifted, not to Moore, not to Gates, but to her mother, to the courtroom years ago where a younger Kamala once sat on a wooden bench, feet barely touching the floor, watching a white man in robes dismiss her community's pain with a smile. That memory had been her fire. She had carried it into law school, into courtrooms where she was mocked for her hair, her skin, her voice. She remembered the sting of judges calling her young lady instead of counselor, the smirks when she raised objections, the warnings that she was too passionate to be taken seriously. And still, she had stayed, she had fought, and now she had won, not for herself, but for everyone who never got the chance to raise their voice at all. Her fingers brushed the folder she had just closed, the one that held Moore's guilty plea, signed and stamped by federal seal. A symbol of something rare, something earned. Behind her, the heavy doors creaked. She turned slowly, expecting a clerk, maybe a marshal. But it wasn't either. A little girl, no older than 8 or 9, stood at the edge of the aisle. Brown skin, braided hair, a bright pink backpack slung over one shoulder. She wore a red hoodie that looked 2 sizes too big and clutched a small notebook to her chest like it was sacred. Her shoes squeaked softly on the polished floor as she stepped forward, each stride hesitant but determined, eyes locked on Kamala like she was watching a hero from a storybook come to life. Kamala's heart caught in her throat. She knelt slightly, lowering herself to the child's level, offering a soft smile, her voice gentle. "Hey there, are you lost?" The girl shook her head quickly. "No, ma'am. I watched everything." She pointed back toward the gallery. "Me and my Nana came to see what everyone was talking about." Kamala's smile widened just a little, but her throat remained tight. The girl looked down at her notebook, flipped through a few messy pages covered in childish handwriting, then looked up again, eyes wide and filled with something fierce. "I just wanted to ask you something," she whispered, voice trembling slightly. Can someone like me be a lawyer too?" The silence that followed was deafening, not because there were no words to say, but because of the weight of the question. Kamala stared at her. This little girl, so full of hope and fear and longing, all wrapped into one fragile question. Her eyes stung. She blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. Not from sadness, not from exhaustion, but from recognition. She saw herself in that child, every courtroom, every rejection, every night spent wondering if her voice would ever matter. Kamala stepped closer, bent down on one knee, and placed her hand gently over the girl's trembling fingers. "Not only can you be a lawyer," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you're going to be better than me." The girl's eyes lit up, as if a switch had flipped inside her, illuminating something no one could dim. "Better?" she whispered. Kamala nodded slowly. "Yes, because you'll grow up in a world where someone like you has already stood here. You'll know it can be done. You'll walk through doors that I had to kick open, and you won't be alone." A tear slid down the girl's cheek. She didn't wipe it. She smiled instead, wide and innocent and powerful. "I want to help people," she said quietly, "like you did today." Kamala pulled her into a gentle hug, holding her tight, the smell of school books and candy clinging to her hoodie. "Then you will," Kamala whispered, "and I'll be there cheering when you do." From the gallery, a soft voice called, "Tasha, come on now." The girl's grandmother stood at the doorway, hand over her heart, tears streaking down her face. Tasha turned and ran to her, waving back with her notebook in hand. Kamala stood slowly, watching them disappear into the hallway, the weight of that moment anchoring her feet to the courtroom floor. She turned back to the empty bench, the silent jury box, the stained wood of a place that had once tried to erase her. But now this room was different. This room had witnessed a future begin. And Kamala knew, no matter how many cases she won, no matter how many walls she broke, that moment was the most powerful verdict of all. Because justice wasn't just about trials. It wasn't about headlines or arrests. It was about lighting a torch and passing it on. And tonight, she had passed it. To a girl with a pink backpack, a notebook full of dreams, and a voice that would one day echo even louder than hers. Kamala turned off the courtroom lights and walked into the night, her heart full. Not with triumph, but with purpose. The fight wasn't over, but the future had just taken its first step toward the bench. And she had been there to witness it. The next morning, the city awoke to headlines still echoing the dramatic conclusion of the federal trial. Newsstands across the city displayed newspapers with bold headlines declaring Gregory Moore's guilty plea, the arrest of 5 high-ranking officials, and Kamala Harris's powerful statement in court. On television screens, replays of Kamala's poignant moment with young Tasha played continuously, captivating millions and igniting conversations in every corner of society. But away from the bright lights and towering skyscrapers, deep within neighborhoods long overlooked by media attention, something extraordinary was quietly taking shape. In a modest classroom in a dilapidated public school on the city's outskirts, sunlight filtered weakly through cracked window panes, illuminating desks that had seen better days. Despite the humble surroundings, the energy was palpable as a young teacher gently placed the morning newspaper on her desk. On the front page was a large photograph of Kamala Harris, standing solemnly at the podium, a symbol of defiant justice. The teacher turned to her students, watching closely as their curious eyes scanned the image. After a moment, a small hand rose hesitantly from the back row. "Miss Jenkins," a boy named Marcus began, his voice cautious yet filled with curiosity. "She looks like me." Why was she allowed to stand up there? How did she do it? The teacher smiled gently, moved by the innocence and power behind his question. Because she fought, Marcus. She refused to back down when people told her she didn't belong there. She showed everyone that justice is for everyone, no matter what they look like. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing her words as his classmates murmured thoughtfully. His simple question ignited conversations in classrooms across the city, spreading from school to school like sparks in dry grass. Kamala's story became a catalyst, empowering countless young children of color who, until now, had seen themselves only as spectators rather than participants in society's halls of power. Outside schools, in local libraries and community centers, workshops sprang up overnight, inspired by Kamala's courage. Young people, once hesitant to speak out, began passionately voicing their dreams and ambitions, encouraged by Kamala's example. A nonprofit organization quickly formed, named The Next Kamala, dedicated to providing scholarships, mentorship, and legal support to minority youth aspiring to careers in law and advocacy. Donations poured in from across the country, bolstered by Kamala's newfound recognition, fueling a movement that quickly became unstoppable. Meanwhile, media outlets that had once doubted Kamala now vied for her attention, eager to share her story not as one of victimhood or struggle alone, but as one of victory and unwavering courage. Major magazines featured in-depth profiles highlighting her journey, detailing every obstacle she'd faced and overcome. Television documentaries chronicled her relentless fight against systemic injustice, bringing her battles into millions of homes. Yet amidst all the acclaim and recognition, Kamala chose a path few expected. Despite lucrative job offers from prestigious law firms, political campaigns courting her endorsement, and media networks begging for exclusive interviews, she packed up her office quietly one evening, leaving the bustling city behind. Her destination was a small, underserved border town where a community legal center struggled to survive, desperately needing someone experienced to train and mentor the next generation of advocates. When journalists finally tracked her down, hoping for explanations, she stood outside the modest building, eyes calm and serene. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said quietly yet firmly. "I don't need to stand in front of cameras or hold political office to make a difference. Real change happens quietly behind the scenes. My work now is to support those who will come after me, to nurture seeds of hope and justice." In that small, overlooked community, Kamala set to work, mentoring aspiring lawyers who reminded her so much of herself when she first began. She taught passionately, sharing her knowledge freely, inspiring her students with stories not just of her victories, but also her defeats and the lessons she'd learned from them. In the evenings, she continued to write letters, responding personally to hundreds of messages from young people across the country who felt inspired by her example. Among those letters, she treasured one above all, written in careful, neat handwriting by young Tasha, who'd bravely approached her after the federal trial. Tasha wrote proudly of drafting her first indictment, detailing the unfair treatment of minority students at her school. Kamala read the letter again and again, smiling softly as she placed her hand over her heart, feeling a deep pride swelling within her. Months passed, and reports began filtering back to Kamala of remarkable changes taking place. Young lawyers she'd mentored were winning cases for impoverished communities, overturning wrongful convictions, and securing fair treatment for those who'd previously had no voice. The ripple effect of her actions had grown exponentially, reaching far beyond what she'd ever imagined. One quiet evening, as Kamala finished up another long day of mentoring students, she was approached by a young woman who had traveled far just to meet her. The woman introduced herself as Maya, a recent law graduate who had followed Kamala's journey from afar. "I watched everything you did," Maya explained passionately, her voice trembling slightly. "You gave me the courage to speak up. I just wanted you to know that because of you, I passed the bar last week. Now I'm going back home to help my community." Kamala embraced her warmly, blinking back tears. "Then my fight was worth it," she whispered, "because people like you are taking it further than I ever could." That night, alone in her small office, Kamala reflected on her journey. The path had been brutal, marked by threats, humiliation, intimidation, and isolation. There were countless nights she doubted herself, questioning whether the fight was worth it. But now, seeing how deeply the seed she planted had taken root, she knew the answer unequivocally. Justice, she realized, was not a singular act, nor was it confined to any one courtroom or individual. It was a living, breathing ideal, passed from generation to generation through those brave enough to carry its torch. Kamala had once carried that flame alone, but now thousands held it aloft, each one determined never to let it be extinguished. As Kamala closed her eyes, she envisioned countless courtrooms across the country, where young lawyers, children who'd once wondered if people who looked like them stand up and speak, now confidently delivered powerful arguments, challenging injustices, demanding accountability, reshaping the system that once sought to silence them. She thought back to Marcus's innocent yet profound question, how did she do it? She smiled softly, knowing the answer was simpler than many realized. She had done it by refusing to be silenced, by standing tall when they wanted her to kneel, by turning each attempt to break her into fuel for the fire within, by showing up even when fear threatened to overwhelm her. She had done it for Marcus, for Tasha, for Maya, for every person who ever felt voiceless or invisible. In that small office, far from the courtroom lights, Kamala knew her greatest victory was not in the arrests she had achieved, nor the headlines she had inspired, but in the lives she had touched, the futures she had ignited. She whispered quietly to herself, words that echoed gently in the silence. This fight was never just mine. It belongs to everyone who dreams of justice. Outside her window, night fell softly, stars emerging one by one, each a small light in the vast darkness. Kamala understood then that she was just one star among many, her brightness no longer solitary, but part of a constellation of hope that stretched endlessly. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that as long as even one person held the courage to fight for truth, justice would never be extinguished. Instead, it would grow, unstoppable, uncontainable, a light capable of illuminating even the darkest corners of society. In that moment of quiet triumph, Kamala felt truly at peace. Her battle had been long and fierce, her victories hard-won. But looking toward the future, she saw clearly. The fight for justice would continue, carried forward by countless voices now emboldened by her journey. The seeds she'd planted could no longer be silenced. They had grown strong, deep-rooted, unstoppable. And that, Kamala knew, was her greatest legacy. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.